Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this seminar series, the first in a series of what's going to be about 9 or 10, if not more. You'll obviously be given notices of this. A special welcome to the seminar leader, which is John Mattison, who I'll introduce in a moment. John, thank you for availing yourself for this. And of course, on behalf of all of us, thanks to the Defend Our Democracy for organizing and hosting this series of seminars, which we hope, and I hope at least, is going to be riveting and interesting and informative, of course, given that we're in the context where we're already started into the election campaign for 2024. And politicians being almost a caricature of themselves, some of them claiming credit for things that they had absolutely no hand in. But in any case, we're going to try not to depoliticize things, not to kind of take things away from politics, but to deepen our political discussion and understanding of things, but try to understand some of them in a technical way. So thanks again to Defend Our Democracy and to John. I want to give it a moment or two before we head off. And before I do that, just a couple house rules. So I think we're all accustomed to using Zoom and have been for a while, but just a quick refresher and a couple house rules. First is because of the bandwidth and because of connectivity problems, and I'm sure we all are very well aware that load shedding is back, some would say with a vengeance. Connectivity is going to be a bit of a problem, so let's keep our cameras off for as long as we possibly can. Of course, when you speak, you have a question, you have an intervention, and John has alerted me to the fact that he would like some interaction and some discussion, so feel free to just raise your hand and indicate as such in the chat, or put your question or your comment or your intervention in the chat box, and hopefully I'll be able to narrate and relate that. If you have a question that you want to ask verbally, again, just lift your hand or indicate that that's the case, and we'll try and unmute you for a moment, and then you'll be able to intervene. All participants will be muted for the most part, just to minimize disruptions and interventions and so on. And so, of course, that's not to preclude people from speaking or participating or otherwise interacting with the seminar series and with the interlocutor. So, with that said, we know that the theme is going to be about the developmental state. What are its successes? What are the weaknesses? Is South Africa a developmental state? Are we going to be on the path to a developmental state? So ultimately, what we're looking at is a reflection of 30 years of democracy, and we are aiming to discuss a developmental democracy, a democracy which is developmental. And in that sense, we will be talking about the state's role and function, and how we can improve the functioning of the state. And to lead us in that discussion, I could think of no one better to do this, who is both rigorous but also accessible than John Mattison, who's going to be our seminar leader. And so before we kick off and give John a moment, in a moment we will give John the opportunity to start leading us in the seminar discussion. There is going to be opportunity for questions, for comments, and so on, and we will have time for that. John will speak for roughly about 45 to 50 minutes, or just a little more or just a little less, so there will be adequate time. Of course, in the meanwhile, as I indicated, if you want to say something, if you want to intervene, you have a comment, you have an interlocutory comment, whatever the case might be, please just indicate that that's the case or put it in the chat, and I'll relate it. So again, welcome everyone, and a final thank you to Defend Our Democracy, the organizers, for hosting us and for having this and for initializing the series. John, welcome to you. And to introduce our speaker and seminar leader is John Mattison. I'm sure he's a name which is familiar to all of you, but just to give you a sense of who he is, and to also just give you a tidbit or perhaps of what you might expect John to say in the seminar series. I can assure you, having spoken to him a little bit before, that there will be revelatory tidbits that you will find very not just interesting, but amusing. And I'll leave those for John. But John is a well-known journalist, is an author, he's a policy consultant, and he began his career at the old, many of you might be too young to remember, but the Rand Daily Mail, which was an apartheid newspaper, which was the newspaper which broke the story of Steve Biko, his abuse, his death, and so on. And during that time, John was actually described by the then apartheid South African state as a security risk. He was one of the first journalists to be given a jail sentence for refusing to reveal a source because he reported in what was then Muldergate scandal. After that, he spent 6 years in Washington as a foreign correspondent, and then he returned to South Africa to work for National Public Radio, which is the public interest broadcaster in the US. Interestingly, after that stint, John was tasked to prepare the first president of the Democratic Republic of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, to be able to handle television, radio, and media interviews, and basically he was Mandela's media trainer. He then worked for the United Nations. He was on the board of the SABC. And in the Mandela government, in that cabinet, he was appointed as the Independent Broadcast Authority's chair of policy on the council, and drove the development of radio and the television industry, the entertainment industry, music specifically, and imposition of local content quotas and so on. He then went on to work in Afghanistan, where he chaired the Electoral Media Commission for the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, and then he became an acting project manager for the UN's election project. He's worked also variously in Lebanon, in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, in Morocco, and has provided media training in many of those countries. But while doing so, he was able to pick up lessons variously from those countries, but also from China and the Asian tigers and several African countries, at how they achieved job-creating growth. He's written 2 books, one on this very subject, which is called Cyril's Choices, An Agenda for Reform, which was published in 2019. And it advances arguments in those books for how South Africa can be fast-tracked. But he has a previous book in which he's sort of delved into certain political ideas, both from the apartheid era and the post-apartheid era, called God's Spies and Lies, which tries to find what South Africa's future might look like through examining parts of the past. He's obviously published very widely. He's broadcast on television, on radio, and so on. He's written for almost every outlet in South Africa, but also internationally, variously in the London Financial Times, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the London Observers, and so on. So this series of webinars is going to be led by John. Some of his work that he will be touching on has already appeared in print. You will find it in the Daily Maverick if you just search it up. It's called Blueprint for Reform. If you just search that on Google, you'll come across that. And if you're looking for something more academic and substantial and policy related, in the future, John, I think, will be publishing in New Agenda, the journal of the Institute for African Alternatives. So that's a little bit about John. I could go on, I won't. And John, I hope that introduction has done you justice. I think you are welcome to now take us through your discussion, and we look forward to hearing for you for the next 50 minutes.
Well, thank you, Ibrahim, and good morning, everyone. I never want. My career has been so sort of unusual that I never know quite how to describe myself. So you've done more than I would have expected. I want to start by asking everybody here if South Africa is a developmental state, and if it is, where is the development in our developmental state? I'm not sure if you're able to respond, or if, Abraham, you're able to pick up people's responses.
I'll be looking, and the team from Defend Our Democracy, Chetza, Zakira, and Zinzi will be looking up. So anyone is able to respond in the chat, or they can just lift their hands, and one of us will recognize them and let them in for a moment.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, I don't want to get bogged down in tech problems, but I mean, normally when people in government talk about a developmental state, when you ask what it means, I mean, things come up like, well, we have the social grant. Well, of course, I support the social grant, but that's not a development program. That's welfare. It has developmental benefits, but it's not development. Obviously, people talk about a universal basic income or basic income grant. I think that's an admirable idea, but again, it's not development as such. It has some development benefits, but it's not really what most developmental states would consider development. And then, of course, you've got the NHI, the National Health Insurance Program. And again, it's a good thing if we can get it going, but it's not development. And of course, perhaps the closest thing we have to developmental policy is a certain amount of government jobs programs. Well, I'm looking at the messages; they seem to reflect that too. So we have the government jobs program, but that's also, the easy way out of giving money rather than doing something sustainable. And so my concern always is, how do we get to be sustainable? And what I want to say is that there's a real answer. And obviously you'll decide after you listen to me whether it's just another bit of hot air or if it's got anything to it. As Ibrahim said, the next edition of New Agenda will talk about it in a more theoretical way. And my book, Cyril's Choices, which came out in 2019, where it addresses that. And I haven't changed my views. I've just developed, there's just more to see since then. So 33 years, how I got into this developmental status was 33 years ago after Madiba came out of prison and I trained in TV. I concluded we were going to have a democratic state. And I started to think about the problem. Sorry, let me get my system going. What would bring us job-creating economic success by looking at the countries that done it? So I discovered the developmental state, and I read and eventually interviewed the man who invented the concept. So this series is my stab at going public about it. Obviously, you're free to disagree, and if you have better ideas than I do, I'll be delighted to change my views. My aim is to offer some guideposts out of our current impasse. As you can gather, I'm no longer young. I'm 73. It's going to be a new generation in South Africa that turns this country around. But before I go, I would like to leave a better foundation than I think our generation seems to have left you. I also worked in the Mandela government, and we were successful in our sector, which was broadcasting, as Abraham referred to. We began building a whole new industry with new, good above-ground jobs. Our first local music content rules played a big part in building the South African music industry. So I know that government can have a positive role. But of course, one of the most important things is you have to have a realistic assessment of the capability of your state. In some areas we're strong, in some areas we're weak, and you have to know the difference. I went to the University of Chicago straight after the event with Madiba, And I started learning what a development state really looked like. And when I came back and went into the government, what I noticed is that that our government has not been good at building on experience and learning from mistakes and from evidence. What we did in the 90s with radio and TV could have been replicated and improved with telecommunications, because we already knew then that was going to be the next big job generator, much bigger than broadcasting, what became the boom in the information economy. But instead of getting better, different people came in, there was no continuity, and serious job limiting mistakes were made. You could say we failed to connect some dots. I see Mike Colley is asking if we're going to present slides. I'm going to present only one slide, Mike, and after that, it's just me. I'm going to spare you too much PowerPoint, because the things you'll see are too depressing. I'm going to depress you with one piece of PowerPoint, and I think that'll send the message. In future webinars, we'll tackle some of the main decisions we need to take to become an effective state again, in security and foreign policy, education, and so on. Some of my proposals might sound quite radical. I can only say I've thought about them carefully. I've consulted many experts and practitioners, and I welcome debate. And if you have realistic alternatives that are better, I'll be delighted to give way. We'll also discuss sequencing policy implementation to help navigate the inevitable political tides that make good policy hard to implement. But I start with jobs, because we have an enormous jobs problem as far as I'm concerned. I had a figure of 12 million this morning. I looked up and I found an article that said our unemployment figure is now 24 million. Now, there's no point debating the exact numbers. We know it's really awful. And without jobs or hope, I think, we're in real trouble. First, we have to face honestly where we are. According to the African Development Bank, South Africa is doing worse than our peers in Africa. In the last 10 years, we dropped from first to third on the continent, behind Nigeria and Egypt. We're behind the African norm, or even the Southern African norm, in growth. The African Development Bank found that our continued underperformance in Southern Africa was dragging down the rest of Southern Africa, and South Africa's dragging down of Southern Africa was primarily the primary cause why Southern Africa is the slowest growing sector in region on the continent. Growth in Africa is projected to stabilize at about 4.1% in 2023-24. As you heard this week from the finance minister, we're at 0.8%. So I just want to show you this one slide, and again, we can don't take the data too seriously. This is a graph comparing our unemployment rate with the rest of the continent. And obviously, some countries' data aren't very good, and so you can debate whether it's totally fair. But I wonder if we can put that one up. I don't know if it's going up. I just wanted to show it to you, just to give you an idea, so that we're not misleading ourselves. Is that going up? Right. So as you see on those statistics, South Africa's unemployment rate is the worst on the entire continent. By the way, I read this morning that until the Gaza war started, our unemployment rate is worse than in Gaza as well. But there you see it. Our unemployment rate is truly the worst in Africa. And frankly, I think we should all be very ashamed of that. Given our opportunities and our resources of all kinds, that really is something we should be very ashamed of. And as I say, you can debate these exact figures. You may tell me that Chad has figures are unreliable and really they're worse than they are, but I think it's enough to show you the point. Okay, I think that's enough pain to inflict on you for a morning. So we can take that down. And and I now want to say that, as I say, if you want backup on data, you can go to those references I mentioned, and of course I'll be delighted to recommend other books as well. So what this shows is, there are several things we tell ourselves, and I want to debunk them so we can get on to the serious business of what is really needed. Obviously, you can't blame our economic decline or poor results on global conditions. All the African states operate under the same global conditions. So if we're doing worse than them, we have to look inwards. There's another rationalization I want to dismiss, and that is that we have jobless growth, because that implies that there's something about current global economic conditions that has led us to a situation where we're getting the growth, but some are not producing the jobs we should. There is some general truth in that, but the reality is we don't really have growth at all. If you account for our population increase, the population is growing slightly faster than the 0.8 of the economy. So the average South African is living with less each year, not more. And that's before you account for inflation and other burdens that South Africans face. So we have to face the fact that South Africa's exceptionalism has been overrated, except, of course, in rugby and now in cricket. And I do take a bit of personal satisfaction that cricket is doing so well, because I had a small role in cleaning up cricket 2 years ago in South Africa. So that's the environment we have to face. So is the answer the developmental state? I've studied the development state, its origins and its implementation in a number of countries. And I started that in 1991 in the University of Chicago, when I left my house in Norwood, Joburg, to Jacob Zuma to occupy after he came out from exile. And while I was at the University of Chicago, what I wanted to understand is, why had Asian countries grown spectacularly? And were there lessons for Africa? Because you know that often people say, well, Asia did very well, but South Africa is too different, but Africa is too different. So the rest of this morning's discussion is about how we get there. Of course, we do have a national development plan. It was written in 2011. It was approved in 2012. Most of the political parties in Parliament supported it, but why has it not made us a developmental state? And some of the answers, I'm not going to go through it too thoroughly, of course, but the National Development Plan has 181 actionable ideas. But take a look at the outcomes. These are ones I just went through the NDP. Here it is in the last few days. I picked out a few at random because I've read it several times. We had to switch from analog to digital broadcasting and swiftly allocate spectrum. That was in 2012. Still hasn't been completed in 2023. We're one of the slowest on the entire continent and in the world. Namibia did it long ago, Mozambique, all of these countries. Some of them, by the way, used South African experts to do it, but we didn't. The National Development Plan says we must cut our number of foreign embassies because we have far more than countries of our size. That didn't happen. The NDP also says we must resolve the permit issue that's delaying mining and mining exploration. As you know, that's still an issue holding up mining exploration today, and it's one of the reasons we're not growing. So what I think that tells you is if you have 181 priorities, you have no priorities. From interviewing people in government, what I found is the DGs, Directors General, have adapted their existing budget lines So they link them to NDP goals. In other words, they don't change what they're doing. They just do the bureaucratic thing. Now, this is standard action in bureaucracies. I saw it when I lived in Washington, D.C. Bureaucracies protect their turf, and whatever the politicians tell them are their goals, they'll link that to what they're doing. But our economic outcomes confirm what those interviewees told me. So we must go to the source. What did the NDP project entail, and how did it compare with what was achieved? Well, let me just give you the targets. I'm going to move on from the NDP. Unemployment in 2012 was at 24.9%. The NDP said that we were going to go to 14% by 2020 and 6% by 2030. And of course, we know that here we are in 2023, and again, we can debate which figure you want to use, but 32% is probably the most directly analogous to what was 24 then. So that's quite, now there were actually pessimistic and optimistic scenarios. The pessimistic scenario said we'd get to about 19% by now, by 2020. And in fact, we're at 38. So we're more or less at doubly bad. So obviously you ask, who in the government is monitoring us? Well, what is the real-time self-correction? And you don't see it. The NDP required a growth in the economy, in the GDP, of 5.4% a year. And we know our annual growth in the 10 years is about 1%. At the moment, as you know, it's even lower. So I'm going to conclude on the NDP with this quote because it gives you an idea of the disconnect between what we said and reality. On page 117 of the National Development Plan, it says, it has this heading, key elements for employment creation. Solving South Africa's most pressing problems involves implementing all aspects of this plan. In order to raise employment, South Africa needs better educational outcomes, a healthier population, better located and maintained infrastructure, a sound social safety net, a capable state, and much lower levels of corruption. That was in 2012. So let's put the NDP aside. It had many good proposals in it, but they required a very committed executive in every case. In a lot of cases, it was vague or required major overhauls in government. And as far as I can tell, those mostly just didn't happen. So I would say the first step forward would be to carefully choose no more than a handful of priorities based on solid, tested evidence that you can defend against experts in public. That might sound easier than it is considering where we are, because where we are currently, government doesn't really expose itself to that kind of challenge in a meaningful way. As any writer on development or developmental state will tell you, industrialization is absolutely crucial to rapid job creation. Yet in 2019, I quoted in my book, Cyril's Choices, Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davies in his last talk before he left office to us in Cape Town, described South Africa as advanced in a period of long-term premature deindustrialization. I mean, when I read that, I thought, God, everybody should see that and be startled, because anything you know about development, industrialization, manufacturing is absolutely crucial. It's the best way towards rapid growth. Obviously, you need lots of sectors to be working together, but industrialization is absolutely critical. And of course, this is the same in the mining sector. A lot of people think the problem with mining in South Africa is, we're running out of minerals. We've got these big old mines, but they're running out. But that's not an accurate understanding of what's happened. What has happened, we're in a long-term decline in mining output by tonnage. It's been disguised over the years when the commodity prices went up. Sometimes they've gone up so well that the fiscus has had a bonus in taxes, and mining companies have had good profits. But the tonnage, which is what really tells you if they're really growing or not, has declined. I would have thought that and the reason is because exploration has declined, and exploration has declined because of the things that the NDP picked out. Like the permit system was a mess, and the delays are far too great. But the other thing, which is perhaps less highlighted in the NDP, is that the constant change of ministers and policies has meant that investors who are asked to put billions into a hole in the ground and take 40 years to get it back need policy certainty. And you can't keep changing ministers. You can be tough on the mining sector. You don't have to give them what they want. But once you do a deal, it has to be good as gold. It really has to be good as gold. I would recommend that coming up, we've got an election next year. We're trying to refresh ourselves, think anew about how to fix South Africa. I would recommend people in government or parliament or in the unions or voters should be checking these indices regularly. Industrial, how the size of our industrial sector and the size of our mining sector, for example, and challenging government. Parliament should be raising this. It's a first requirement of job creation. So the next thing I want to say about where we go forward is that you can't be ambivalent about growth. When you have unemployment figures like ours, I've read the anti-growth literature and I'm familiar with the climate change issues, and there's a lot we can do about that. But when you have unemployment as high as ours, 12 or 24 million, whichever thing you say, it's so high and it's so bad compared to other countries that you can't realistically think you can increase jobs without growth. You've got to have growth, and you've also got to commit yourself to making it a top priority. As I worked on this project, several quotes kept coming to my mind. And the first one came from the man who invented the term developmental state. And I studied him and I interviewed him, and I'm going to tell you about him in a moment. One of the things he said, which I quote in my choices, is that a state's first priority will define its essence. He argued that the first priority in the countries that succeeded was growth. And so you can ask yourselves, is that our priority? Do we incentivize job creation as highly as we incentivize BEE, for instance? And I think that's really an important issue that we need to face. So he would argue that the country's essence needs to be growth, and what I wanted to say is that what I've realized about South Africa is that we can choose a few, based on testable evidence, no more than a handful of priority sectors where job creation is enormous. And at each level, in other words, there are jobs for graduates, for young graduates, for matriculants, for unskilled and semi-skilled people. We also need to build national respect for the work of technical people in construction, carpentry, painting, plumbing, where good paying jobs need to be filled, unless you want to leave all those jobs to people who are trained by Afric Forum and Solidarity, who have a technical college training blue-collar workers who are getting well-paid jobs. We're very lucky in South Africa that we have all these remarkable opportunities. But before I get to that, I wanted to understand why Japan, when I got to the University of Chicago in 1991, I wanted to, the American press all told us that Japan was about to overtake America as the world's biggest economy. Its success was remarkable, and they said it was so good compared to, and China was so bad, this is about 1990, 91, because unlike China, Japan had a free market democracy. It sounded logical, where the state got out. Sounded logical, but I dug deeper, and then I found the man who worked out how Japan actually did it. He was an American who started his life as a Republican in the US Navy. His name was Chalmers Johnson, and this is his book. He happened to be in Japan at the end of the war and learned Japanese, and it was Chalmers Johnson who, after studying how Japan actually did it, invented the term the developmental state, and he used it to describe Japan's remarkable economic rise and how it actually happened. That's the book. It was my Bible at one stage. What Chalmers Johnson found was that the state had a key role in Japan's spectacular success, as opposed to just doing okay. I suspect in the process he stopped being a Republican. As I realized the American press had it completely wrong about Japan, I kept thinking of this quote, which I also use in my book. It comes from Will Rogers, although it's not even clear, it's definitely from him. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And you'll find that that's a regular theme in discovering how you really get growth in economies, as opposed to what the Washington consensus said, or what conventional wisdom has. But so just as lots of people in the American press were telling us that Japan was about to overtake the American economy, it actually stalled. For reasons we don't have to go into now, but they do have some echoes for what we can expect in China in coming decades. I should tell you that Japan is still doing very well for the size of its population and so on. So it's not a collapse. It's just that it stopped growing and it's now just ticking over. But what was really happening was that China was rising and it was well on the way to overtaking Japan. It was achieved by the greatest economic reformer in the history of the world, Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping studied what Japan had done. Under Deng's leadership, China has brought 800 million people out of poverty. So when he talks, whatever you think of other things about the political system there, he's worth listening. He's worth listening to. Now, I want to tell you something that Deng Xiaoping, when he was in power, of course, he died a number of years ago, he met African leaders and he tried to pass on what he'd learned. He gave each of them the same advice about the lessons from China's rapid job creating development. He said when he met with Jerry Rawlings, Ghana, President Rawlings, he said, we have found our own way. Don't just copy China's model. You have to walk your own path. If there's any relevant Chinese experience for you, I'm afraid it's only one thing: seek truth from facts. You must formulate your own policies and plans according to the actual situation of your own country. During the process, you must learn the lessons in a highly timely fashion to keep the good things and correct the wrong ones. That's perhaps the most relevant this experience for you. Okay, Mike, we will put the names in a moment when I get a chance, and you can email me and follow up with other books which you might be interested in. What Deng meant was that a lot of people say, well, we can't do in Africa what they did in China or Japan, because their method was to start with cheap manufacture of clothing and electronics and move up the chain. And you can't do that in South Africa because we have unions and our salaries and wages are too high and so on. Well, those are factors. But the point Deng is making, I think quite specifically, is Our solution wasn't, our lesson isn't go for clothing and then into electronics. Our solution was we looked at the situation on the ground and we found that we had this mass of impoverished people earning nothing and we could do it. You have other opportunities. Now, Deng had a meeting with Robert Mugabe as well, and he recounted the lessons China had learned from the effects of a rigid state economic control and the destabilization from the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. We know about these conversations from Deng's interpreter, Professor Zhang Weiwei. Professor Zhang says Mugabe argued back. He didn't accept Deng's advice, and Deng actually got quite irritable. And I think looking back, I think I'd choose the Chinese outcome over Zimbabwe. But the interesting thing now that brings us closer to home is that these examples have been studied elsewhere in Africa with great success. I don't know how many of you are aware that the fastest growing country in the world from 2009 to 2019 was an African country. And it wasn't Rwanda, it was Ethiopia. And Ethiopia and several other countries that I'll touch on, African countries, consciously adopted development state principles. But unlike South Africa, they closely tracked implementation with a consistent culture of real-time error correction. Growth mattered more than politics. And Ethiopia is far from the only country that has adopted these principles and climbed the ladder of the top growth countries. So that should make it optimistic. Us optimistic. It's not true it can only be done in Asia. It's not true our strong unions and high wages make it impossible for South Africa. I'm not saying these aren't factors to take into account, but I am saying the correct lessons from China and Japan are not to do exactly what they say, what they did, not at all. We'll go into the specifics of what Ethiopia, Rwanda, or Kenya did in the next webinar. But first of all, I want to talk a bit about, just give you a couple of examples to show you why we, where we could be getting things right, but have failed to take the opportunity. First of all, the lesson of Deng Xiaoping and of Japan and of African states doing better than us through a developmental state policy is not primarily about the state's role in ownership. Ownership is less important, much less important, than public interest in state strategy, public interest in state strategy, grounded in a deep understanding of your own economy and the global trends best suited for your economy to explore. On that, there should be no compromise. Don't think the state can come down from the lofty heights of union buildings, tell an industry what to do and how to do it, without studying the industry and the global trends it is attached to. And that seems to be part of the explanation why government efforts to get mining to move to beneficiation seems to have mostly failed. You probably, many of you are aware that government, the ANC has had policy ever since I can remember that, we bring gold and platinum and diamonds out of the ground, so we should, I don't think we're doing any diamonds anymore. So we should be doing other things like smelting and jewelry. I think it's a perfectly good idea in principle. But industry has just found it doesn't work for them. There's another example I want to touch on, and that is, you may remember that President Ramaphosa and many other government officials have talked about the fourth industrial revolution being a great job creator. Actually, I'm going to come back to that a bit later, but the point is that it really isn't, and I'll explain why in a moment. So the point is that there's no shortcut. I mean, in other words, the good news is we could be doing phenomenally, not just okay, but phenomenally. But there's no shortcut to getting a solid understanding of your own economy and your government's real capability. Where the government has capability, you can do lots of things. Where the state has no capability, don't load things onto it that won't happen, because that's just shows you're not taking seriously the job at hand. It also means you can't just appoint people into SOEs who are experts on governance. They have to be sector experts. They have to know their sector, and you have to maintain continuity. And of course, you can't do as we just saw with the SABC, is leave them without a board for 6 months. That, under the circumstances, has been a great pain to the SABC. I mean, that's, those are things that I could bring a government down in some country. So in my understanding of the developmental states, sector solutions are far more important than battles over the role of the Reserve Bank or other grand macroeconomic demands. Though obviously all these issues are relevant. I want to just give the example of Ethiopian Airlines to compare with SAA. As you know, probably know, Ethiopian Airlines has been eating SAA's lunch. SAA went bankrupt while the Ethiopian Airlines, in an absolutely impoverished country, nothing like our kind of sophistication, has opened more and more routes. Many of us now fly Ethiopian from Joburg to Europe when we used to fly SAA. So I would have thought if we were, if we had parliamentary members who really wanted to get things done, to make changes, they would go to Ethiopia, find out from the Ethiopians how they did. By the way, there are South African scholars who've done this research, so it's available here too, to understand why should Ethiopian Airlines be doing so well and SAA so badly, and come back and implement it. Well, one of the things you might be interested to know is that Ethiopian Airlines is state-owned, just like SAA. So why is theirs successful? Well, a very simple answer is that they took the decision to give the state said to Ethiopian Airlines, they helped them put in the very best people, best experts on airlines, and told them there'll be no interference from government, but if you fail, there'll be no bailouts either. And that one decision, which was consistently implemented, has been a great success. So, that should be at the top of any serious debate about the future of SAA. Now, at this stage, it's probably going to be privatized, but but the way we're going about it is what gives me additional reasons for concern. How are we for time? Okay, so I think we need to speed this up. So I'm going to just tell you a few more things that I think are rather significant and pull it to a close. Give me a moment. Yeah. So yeah. In just very quickly, there are three global trends that South Africa missed in the 29 years of democracy that we were perfectly poised to exploit. Now, obviously, some global trends are a problem for us. When I believe fourth industrial revolution is one of them. We can't avoid it, but don't look for jobs there. But in the 90s, it was the information boom. And we missed it, and I talked about it. Both my books will talk about it next in coming sessions, but I won't try and explain it now. In the noughties, the great, the 2000s, the great global trend that was perfectly aligned for South Africa to benefit from was the resource boom led by Chinese expansion into heavy industry. And we missed that. As I explained earlier, our output continued to fall. In the next 10 years, the teens, and still continuing today, is another global trend that South Africa is perfectly poised to exploit, and where, again, as in the others, there's plenty of private sector money available, billions, if we handle it right. And that is the green economy. And green economy, remember, includes electricity, but it has implications for minerals that we have that are needed for the green economy, like manganese and rare earths and many other things. We also can't hold back the tide. I have sympathy for people in the coal sector and miners, of course. Of course, you worry about jobs, and jobs will decline over time, not very fast, but they will decline in coal. But what you have to understand is that several of our export partners for the cars we produce won't be accepting petrol engine cars from 2030, like the UK, I believe. So you can't wait. We had a report this week that the government is delaying giving an answer on how they want the sector to proceed. So all three of these things we missed, but we could have exploited them, and we still can. We missed a lot, but all of that is still doable today. I want to end, because I think we're running low on time, and I want to give us time to chat. The latest country that is using government to intervene, betting on economic sectors crucial to arrest its decline, using a brilliant economist as an advisor, who is also the advisor to President Ramaphosa, is the United States under Joe Biden. They both use a well-known economist called Marianne Mazzucato. Now, when Biden came to power, the US was spooked by the effects of Trump and previous failures. Infrastructure was getting very behind in America, and lots of other things. Biden set out to revive the US economy, and obviously taking over from Trump. Trump was an economic nationalist. He wanted to fight China economically, but his methods were chaotic. You remember he imposed arbitrary tariffs on China. They were badly targeted. They were scattershot. They didn't achieve what they were supposed to. But Biden came to office, he used that surge of economic nationalism to do things more systematically using industrial policy. You may recognize it as the developmental state. So Biden has poured somewhere close to $2 trillion into a small set of sectoral priorities. First was infrastructure, which haven't been upgraded for decades. The second was the green economy, to speed up the US's ability to compete with China's leadership in green energy. And the third was the so-called CHIPS Act, to restore America's semiconductor manufacturing. So to help him do it, he turned to Mazzucato. And she is making waves in many parts of the world, arguing that the West was nuts to stop using the state consciously to achieve economic objectives. She's a great believer in the strong state. Ramaphosa quoted from one of her books the other day. She advised Biden's Secretary of Commerce on industrial policy. They implemented her advice, and it's doing fantastically well. That program is a big part of the reason the US economy is now growing faster than China's. We don't know how long that'll last, of course, but the CHIPS Act and the others have with government seed money or credits, have poured in hundreds of millions, billions of private sector investment. Now, I'm not close enough to know what she might have achieved in South Africa, although I'm not aware of any. And I've heard her say some countries she advises she finds very frustrating. But the lesson I've drawn from this and all my other experiences is that consultants' answers are only as useful as your questions are refined. In the case of Biden, his team had already decided to go in for computer chips, but they asked her advice on what they were missing in their plans. And she made a powerful two suggestions that were adopted. She said, trouble with American industrial policy under Bush and Obama was that Bush and Obama continued to socialize losses and privatize profits. In other words, when the banks got into trouble or General Motors got into trouble, the government bailed them out. But when they became very profitable, they kept all the profits. So what they call socialism for companies when they fail, capitalism for the companies when they succeed. It's also a lesson she likes to point out about Obama's massive state funding of a precocious Pretoria boy named Elon Musk, who received hundreds of millions of government money in loans and subsidies for Tesla and for SpaceX, but let's talk about Tesla. Government had shares in Tesla, but they had a clause that allowed Musk to pay it back early as a loan and take back all the shares. And the result was Musk got help from the government when he needed it, and government paid out money. But when the profits came in, he kept the profits. The state that took the risk, but Musk did not share the reward. And some of you might know that Musk is now a fierce campaigner against state involvement in the economy. Hypocrisy is not new. So Mazzucato set some rules for the Biden administration. Companies receiving support or subsidies can't use their profits to buy back shares, for example, and they must reinvest the profits in America to grow the economy. And so far, it's been a big reason for what has saved the US. I think I'm going to stop here. Next webinar, I'm going to tell you about Japan and China did it, how Ethiopia and Rwanda and other African states did it, how we can turn things around fundamentally. But I want to leave you with this one thought from Deng Xiaoping, who remember lived through the Long March, the cultural upheavals, the Chinese Revolution. And he said that reform is China's second revolution. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. There's quite a bit of activity in the chat, which should please you, simply because it means that people have been engaging, listening to the questions, putting down thoughts. And there's already a hand. Let me go straight to that before I even say anything. Ismail, over to you. Can we unmute Ismail, please? Ismail Lavanji.
Can you hear me?
There we go.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm just curious about something. Have we ever considered to actually understand how the Afrikaner did it? I mean, I often hear about the Chinese model and the European model or whatever models we have out there. But did we ever try to understand how the Afrikaner did it? Granted, his ideology might have been for all the wrong reasons, or he might have done it for all the wrong reasons, but he has been fairly successful, in or providing us some sort of a model for a developmental state. I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to put that question out there and leave it. Thank you.
Answer it now or wait?
I think go for it. I think it's better
Yes, because yes, I think that's better too.
Yeah.
Yes, well, just briefly, I mean, I have studied that a lot, and my first book I talk about the role of Roodenborg quite a lot because I had access to that kind of understanding. I mean, essentially, I never like making analogies between countries, so I'm not going to call apartheid Nazism. Apartheid was apartheid, which is bad enough. But their economic policy had real similarities to National Socialism of Hitler, which, in other words, they used the state very consciously to aid one ethnic group. We could, I don't know that I want to say much more about that now. Of course, I mean, the thing is, I think there are lessons from it, but I think we also have to use those lessons, but also think afresh about where we are today. Obviously, we need to get to much bigger populations. Obviously, it's a bigger problem. I mean, several things they did. They gave employment to Afrikaners at preference to others. They did put money into a number of issues, and the Broederbond played a role in helping to build different sectors. I mean, for instance, insurance. And you have this, by the way, in Black African Americans communities often in the early years of business would support African American insurance companies. The Afrikaners did that. And so you got the rise of Sanlam. And of course, even Rembrandt and John Rupert, they got community support to buy into those companies and help them build. So they had a bank, and they put people, they used the bank to support. They used local ethnic support to build the banks. So there are things. I mean, there are plenty of things, but I think I would say these days China and Japan are at least as interesting. But we should be open to everything.
If I may, I mean, there's also the question of scale, right, which you've alerted us to. So we're talking about redistribution effectively amongst 4 million or 6 million, depending on the data you want to use, of a particular color or ethnic group, as opposed to a population of 46 or more million. So scale does matter in this case, and I'm sure it's issues we're going to touch on later on. But Fixie, Gwena, there was a hand from you. So let's go straight to you, and John can respond directly. Ismail, while you're at it, will you lower your hand? It's a bit confusing. Fixie, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to get this platform and say something about what I've heard so far. So the thought that jumped to me from the get-go when I heard the question of developmental state was maybe a positive thing, right? I thought about the human development policy, especially in education, right? And I will use a personal experience or a micro example from my own village, where in a street of around 1 kilometer, we had, I think it was one teacher, right, back in the early 80s. But in the 90s, the number went up to about 3, 4, right? And I'm one of the persons in my family to get a degree, right? So post 1994, I think in terms of human development, when you look at the academia, we have more people who hold post-matric qualifications, right? And I'm referring to mainstream public institutions. Okay, we've got more of those people, because when I look back, when I was in primary, majority of our teachers did not hold a university degree. At best, they had what we called a college diplomas. But I think in terms of the number of people holding degrees, if we are to look at human development, we have made progress in that. the question of the quality of these degrees, perhaps it's another debate. I don't want to go there. So this brought to my mind when I look back at the 1776, 1778 in the US, when the first president came in. One of their policy to uplift America was to focus on education, and they did well in that, right? As a parting shot, on the negative side, in 1994, I think we did a disservice as a country when I think we closed. I speak to be corrected. I think we closed what was called technical colleges, where one could become a technician, a plumber, and diploma. We used a good quality of people from that, and now I'm not sure if we are pivoting back to it, but we introduced something called TVETs, where a person can get an electricity certificate or engineering certificate for on the academic side for less than a year, right? They call it a trimester, 3 times, and then 2 years will be spent in the service sector, accumulating experience. I think we dropped a ball there. So perhaps that explains a question of the decline in our infrastructure. When you look at maintenance of water pipes, when you look at the shortage of skills at ESCOM. So I think we may have dropped the ball there, but we are improving on the academic side. So in terms of human development policy, there's something to say about that. Perhaps at a higher level, if we can open up to involving more of these academics in our public institutions in shaping our policy than what is called political deployees, who tend to be short-termism in their approach as opposed to long-term approach. Thank you very much for the part.
Thank you. I'll just answer very briefly, because we are going to discuss education for a full webinar in the new year. But I do just want to say your point about and there's a lot to say. And of course, there's no doubt we made progress. We made progress in a lot of areas. But I did just want to say, as I mentioned in my talk, AfriForum and Solidarity have seen the gap, and they've set up a college to train plumbers and electricians and so on. And I've talked to Jonathan Jansen, the educationist, about this a lot. And the point he makes, which I think is important, is, there was a feeling in 1994, and it's been true in other African countries after liberation, that Africans deserve to go to university like whites did, and not be just, not have to go to inferior training. And so it's really, and those jobs are so important, and many of them can be very well paid, better than the academics or journalists get paid. But we need to build respect for those jobs so that the public understands them as valuable jobs and doesn't see them as second best.
Thanks. All the comments are quite important. I'm going to run through some of them on the side, but I'd like to draw your attention to one comment, which is in response to Ismail's question about how Afrikaners did it. And there's an important point being made about the hyper exploitation of cheap labor, particularly and especially Black South Africans, the creation of the Bantustans, the cheap labor policy, through the spatial development of townships, and so on, influx control, all kinds of that whole package of weird policies. But I just thought I'd draw everyone's attention to that comment from Shamini Brooks. It's in the chat. There's a whole other important questions. If there are no other hands, I want to come to some of the comments which are made in the chat, in the highlighted, and anyone who's written in the chat who feels they want to verbalize it, please feel free to do so. I'd like to give you an opportunity. But John, before I go on, and I don't want to summarize anything, but I want to pose Just one or two questions to you quickly, if there aren't any other questions which come up, and I see some hands are going up, so I will come to you. But let me abuse my privilege as the facilitator to pose the question I have. You spoke quite a bit at length about jobs, I mean, and growth, right? And I mean, I imagine, are you suggesting, or at least I'm imagining you to suggesting, that redistribution of this growth will happen through job creation rather than other means? Am I right in apprehending that that's perhaps what you're suggesting, John? And is there, while on that theme, is there an artificial distinction, or is the distinction artificial rather, between growth and redistribution? Now, I mean, I know you've gone through the literature on degrowth and so on, but is this, it was a popular debate in the early 2000s. What must we privilege, growth or redistribution? Because if we have an economy just maintaining its size, if you have better redistribution, will you not have better development? That was the weird sort of debate. And I wonder if you have a thought on that before I come to two other hands.
Just briefly, look, it's not either or. My focus is on growth, not because I'm against redistribution. I'm for it. As I say, I'm in the universal basic income grant, social grants. Those all have benefits. But my point is that I saw a study that said if we don't achieve a minimum of 3% annual growth, we won't be able to afford the redistribution we're currently doing. And in fact, that's the crisis we've been dealing with this week, that you've seen the IEJ, the Institute for Economic Justice, and others saying, saying we can't have austerity now. Well, I have no quarrel with them. I'm very sympathetic to them. The point is, if we can't get back to growth, we will get more austerity. And so that's really the bottom line.
All right. Nokutula, your hand is up. Nokutula Chakane.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, John, for your presentation. I just wanted to find out, if we look back at some of the examples that you were looking at, like the Japanese miracle, the Asian tigers, you would see that they had more of an authoritarian regime. And with us as South Africa, do you think maybe this democratic regime might be part of the challenges that South Africa is having in actually having this developmental state being realized? Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's a very important and awkward question, because obviously I'm a Democrat. I desperately want to keep democracy, and we can keep our democracy, but we can't keep it if we don't grow. You're right. A sort of benevolent dictator or a growth-oriented dictator can move faster than we can as Democrats. But I don't think it's impossible. And I think one of the reasons I'm optimistic is that we're so damn lucky in South Africa. We have all these minerals. We have solar and wind opportunities to take advantage of the green energy. Many countries don't have that. We're just so lucky. And then, of course, the information economy. We just happen to be superbly placed for it. If none of these existed, it might be harder. But it does, of course, there's no doubt authoritarian countries do it easier. But we can do it. And if we don't do it, I really question the future of our democracy. So we have a tough political battle to get this across to governance, to political parties, to predominant political parties. But if they better pull finger, because if we don't move on growth, we have put our democracy at risk.
Thanks. I'm reading, there's quite a few comments in the chat, and I'm wondering whether Ila Gandhi would like to unmute herself and perhaps both pose a question, but also narrate some of the things she's mentioned in the comment. Ila, I'm wondering if you're prepared to do that. I don't want to colonize the space. I don't see any other hands. So guys, please feel free to do so. Ila, while I wait for you to indicate whether you would want to. There we go.
Yeah. So what I was saying in my chat is that firstly, during apartheid years, we always talked about intensive labor industries. So in an industry, instead of limiting, because, there was that whole idea of lean and mean. And we said that that is gross capitalism, to have, few people exploited and working, many hours. If you had more people working in a factory, in an industry, you provide employment to larger groups. And in that way, you try to eliminate unemployment. That's the one point that I was making. The second point is about cooperatives, effective cooperatives, not the way that we have them. We're in a cooperative. There is equality amongst all the people who own the cooperative, such as, worker-owned industries, and things like that. If we had those kinds of models, I think they work in Spain, in Italy. They have been working very well, these kinds of models. But I'm not an economist, so I don't want to go further into it. I just feel that maybe these are some models that we can look at. The third point that I had is about Afrikaner, model. And yes, the scale was lower when Afrikaners did away, were able to eliminate the white poverty that existed just after the war. And some of those models can easily be implemented if we don't look at growing some people into millionaires and others into poverty. If we had something where everyone could have access to basic necessities of life and, have a source of livelihood, that kind of model can really work. So, the large tracts of land that were given to Afrikaners, instead of giving large tracts, give medium-sized tracts to people to farm with adequate support. What is happening at the moment is we distribute land, but we don't give them support to practice agriculture. So what happens is people start building houses, and you have this large crowded housing schemes, because land is used for housing purposes and not for agriculture. If we had that in mind, I think we could look at something. So those were some of the points I made. Thank you. Thank you for giving.
Thanks, Ila. And Shamini Brooks, there's a important comment again, and I wonder if she might want to, or he might want to verbalize and perhaps say it out and pose a question, which might be there. It's more a comment, but there might be a question lurking in there. But I want to just go back for a moment, John, on this question of, you were talking about Mazzucato developing this policy, or perhaps a prescription for the US, that any government supported innovation mustn't allow a buyback. So it's basically saying it's prescriptive policy through the back door, right? It's mandatory reinvestment in a way in the economy. So it's prescriptive policy through the back door. Now, in policy terms, we can adopt that approach. There are all kinds of things. I've argued for perhaps moderately increased corporate tax rates, a once-off wealth tax across race, not restricted, and so on. Mandatory reinvestments in the policy, back in the economy, perhaps 2% of revenue, which must be prescribed minimum creation of jobs per sector, and so on. The problem with any of these, including Mazukato's proposals, is if there's such low levels of trust in government, why would you want to give them more authority?
Yes, well, we'll talk about that, and then I'll go back to Elegandi's comments because I'd like to respond to them. I mean, there is no doubt. Shamila, I'll come to your point in a moment as well. There's no doubt that there should be space to raise more funding from the private sector. But again, for me, one of the mantras there's another developmental economist that I've been reading that I like, Stefan Durkon, who makes the point that whatever in Africa, he's really an Africa specialist, done field work all over Africa. And he talks about the key factor that you've got to understand the capability of your state before you do anything. There are areas where you can do a lot, but only if you know that your state is capable. So obviously you would never say, Durkheim would never approve of us saying, let's start another state ESCOM, because when we can't manage the first one. If we could manage the first ESCOM brilliantly, and we had capacity to spare, then it might be a discussion. But as things stand, there's no reason for that discussion. There's no purpose in that discussion. The higher corporate tax or wealth tax, if you start to show that you can deliver results, I think there's space for that. The problem is, in the environment we're in now, you've got to do something that starts to make things work. I mean, one of the things I think we've been so disappointed about in the last few years is we assumed, that we sort of projected onto President Ramaphosa that he would surely show us one or two things that really succeed. So you start to feel confident and say, okay, well, I can see the states trying. I can see an example of it. So I'll put money into it. But I want to go back to Ella's points. First of all, her last point, which is about agriculture. I think that's really important, and I will talk about agriculture as a fourth category in some coming webinars. One of the things we know is that there are about 200,000 to 250,000 black smallholder farmers who are managing to make a living out of farming, despite, as she correctly points out, the lack of government support. We need to expand extension services for smallholder farmers. We need to expand marketing co-ops is one way, financing, transport, advice, seed assistance, all of those things. And that would pay off remarkably. I mean, I've been reading, for instance, Ben Cousins has written about this extensively. So I think that's absolutely true. And of course, we have another problem, which is tenure, but let me not get into that now. What were the other issues she raised? I mean, the government should be doing more, excuse me, in terms of universal service. I mean, we have a policy to expand free Wi-Fi access as much as possible in South Africa. But as far as I can see, a lot of it has gone sour. It hasn't worked as well as it should have. We certainly haven't met our targets. I mean, that would be an absolute no-brainer way to assist people. But my first, given that the state is currently so weak, what I've been looking at as a first step is ways that we can get more money into the system in a way that will increase revenues, but will increase trust and it will increase jobs at the same time. And then you have to move sequentially, step by step.
There are two hands before I say anything, and I want to recognize them both, Thibale Makatu and Silo Mlangeni. So the both of you, please, if they can be unmuted and pose their questions. Ismail, Ismail Evangelos, your hand still seems to be up, and I don't know if it's a new hand or an old one, but I want to give people who haven't had an opportunity to speak, the opportunity to speak. So I think first Thibale Makatu and then Silo Mlangeni, in that order. Before we round up. Surprisingly, we still have the amount of people we started with, which is excellent for Saturday morning. So go ahead, Thibale.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. I've been invited by one of your colleagues, Cheza, and I highly appreciate this very much. I've been following what you do, your work on Twitter and other platforms. And thanks for the facilitator, John. You really hit the spot, mind the pan. My issue here is, whilst we're discussing this fundamental question to address challenges for South Africa, we tend to be distracted by, some of the ideologies that does not really sit well generally. I wouldn't want to repeat that, and it's quite regrettable. I happen to be privileged to have sat in a meeting where AfriForum abroad was denigrating South Africa. And I had to stand up in my broken Afrikaans to defend South Africa in the presence of the late President F.W. de Klerk. And it was quite astonishing, the kind of support that AfriForum has been, garnering abroad. And that was like, 7 or so years ago. And they were talking about this university that everyone now starts singing a song about it, as if the capital that was being raised is not at the back of the oppressed. Obviously, they would not have raised money if they didn't get anything, locally. But that is besides the point. My small contribution, and I would like the facilitator to also maybe try to give direction, is with the scale of corruption that we have, and corruption in this instance not to be equated or be conflated with cadre development, cadre deployment. Because as far as I'm concerned, you get to any government institution. Yes, there has to be skills and all that, but you have to surround yourself with people who can control the line. That is why from one administration to another, in most developed countries, then there is this team that comes in, no matter how much we dislike them. We saw it also with Trump, a bad example to use. So corruption will be one of my main issue. And coming from Tando, I always look at, the Sunday afternoon. Every Sunday afternoon, you see all these well-heeled young men and women retracing the steps of our forefathers who went to the major centers of the world or of South Africa to seek an opportunity. So now, these are new migrants, albeit that they live probably in better conditions, because the infrastructure that we have hasn't changed that very much. So you still get the N1. Yeah, you still get the N1 that sort of takes everything into the major centers of the world, and that is on the human capital side. It is the same with the mineral resources. They all hop on the N1 down to the N3 to be exported. Now it brings in that whole issue of the value chain. What is it that we're not doing in order to ensure that we value add our mineral resources? I just used these two simple examples to draw my point. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. I think we should take Silo and then we can round up because we are sort of nearing the end of time. Silo, if you wanna come in before John answers and takes the round of questions, and let's try and round up after that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brad. Thank you, John. I'm going to be short. And, I think we're going to think about developing the country development as well, and ending or trying to mitigate the number of unemployment. I have this crazy idea that maybe we have to think out of the box. We become a country that does not sleep, meaning that we work 24 hours shift in production, whatever. And because if let's say many companies can open to that, then they'll have more people employed, And I think in that way, we can see that we can eliminate poverty and all that stuff. Thank you. I just want to be short there. Yeah.
Thanks, John.
Okay. So there's several questions. Just on the last one, well, yeah, I'm not sure that I have anything useful to say about 24-hour cycles of work. My focus is to get more people into jobs and to expand. And there's no doubt the cake can grow, and that's the easiest low-hanging fruit where you can really get massive new jobs and better living conditions over time. I want to link. Now the question before that was about corruption. On corruption, I wanted to say this: we will be talking about security and justice later in this series. But for the moment, the key thing is to stop corruption. And as you separated it from cater deployment, which is a different issue, to stop corruption, there's no other way than having the rule working again. And we know it's not working nearly well enough. Until you have police investigating and prosecuting and presenting to prosecutors, and prosecutors effectively bringing their cases and getting them convicted in court, corruption will not decline. I mean, that's the very sad reality. And so it raises all sorts of questions, which I have really what might be quite controversial answers, but you have, which we'll come to in the relevant webinar. But the fact is, there's no point coming with new laws or saying, oh, we must bring back the death penalty. People commit crimes because they don't think they're going to be caught. They don't say, I'll kill someone if I only get life, but I won't kill them if I can get executed. I mean, all the research I'm aware of shows if you want to cut crime, you've just got to increase the competence and effectiveness of your police and prosecuting authorities. And that should be an absolutely razor sharp focus for us. But I don't see any shortcut out of that. Now, there was a message from Ismail, which I thought was very interesting. He talked about what he finding it incredulous that state departments don't talk to each other, where there could be multiple solutions. And that I couldn't agree with that more. When I was on the SABC board, I realized that the Treasury and the Finance Minister had a wrong understanding of SABC on a number of key issues. And I kept asking for meetings. And they said to me in the board meeting, someone said to me, oh, do you want war? In other words, there's a protocol in government that you keep departments and ministries in silos. You don't talk to each other except through your own minister. And often your own minister has a reason to be reluctant to encourage that meeting, that discussion. And so lots of things could have been fixed in that way. So it's a massively important thing. That's what they call silos, that ministries work in silos and don't talk to each other. There is no doubt in my mind that has to be broken down. If it's not broken down, we'll really not make the kind of progress we need to. You also raised the question about the value chain, how you get up the value chain. Well, that's what the Japanese and the Chinese have been doing so brilliantly. But even in Ethiopia and other African countries, where they have people in government who really focus on this problem and are not distracted by short-term politics. There's a term for it in developmental economics. It's called embedded autonomy. We won't go into what that means right now, but the point is that the more you build up capacity in the state that starts looking at value chain upgrade, that's absolutely the key to rapid growth and rapid job creation and moving into the middle class. You know that Kenya has now become a middle income country. And that was a goal they set themselves about 12, 14 years ago, and they achieved it. And they applied some things not so well, but some of them well enough on exactly that point to get there. I think that's probably all, Ibrahim, unless there's anything more you wanted to say.
Right. No, I think we should round up there, and I think we will touch on some of these issues as we go out. There's a question about going beyond the technical aspects and economic models that would have worked. How important are issues of common national identity to implementing a national development plan? I suspect we'll have to leave that question for another time. I think it's an important one, but a contestable one around the question of identity and so on. But we can come to that, John, perhaps in the next webinar, which is on, by the way, the 18th of November, where we are looking not just at the economic models from China and Japan and selected high-growth African states, and perhaps we can embrace the question, Mr. Saluji, about the question of national identity when we revisit this. So the next one, everyone, on the 18th of November, it will be the same time. Thank you, everyone, for staying, especially on a Saturday morning. Before we close out, I just want to highlight a few things. Firstly, is that John has highlighted the question of sequencing and rationalization of priorities for a country in your national development plan. By the way, you know, Malawi has had a national development plan for a very long time. And some people would say, hey, having a development plan is actually no recipe for success, because you can have success. I mean, Lesotho has had development plans for a very long time, but if your politics fail, then your government will likely be poor, mostly because government and governance is a post-political fact. It can't, so, you know, axiomatically, if you have bad politics, you're going to end up with bad government or poor government priorities, and how you're going to implement them. Third, continuity in government, and perhaps not about changes in the political administration, but at least settlement and continuity in the administrative interface with policy, getting back to basics. And perhaps that's something we will touch on in future seminars. Lastly, I want to leave us with this: not even a site of dispensing patronage, which would be normal, because you get into power.
I think we've lost Ibrahim, but the line was getting very bad. So perhaps we should end it here. I'll just say that the issues that have just been raised, I'd love to talk about the next time, this question of national identity and a vision and how important that is, and also whether development plans are of any use. But perhaps let's terminate it now while we still have a line. Thanks very much to everyone for coming along, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone else. We will share details for the next webinar session.